Good evening and welcome to this edition of Viking.TV. I hope you enjoy the video, much of which was recorded here within our Egyptian exhibition at Highclere Castle. I will be back to answer your questions in approximately a quarter of an hour. Look forward to speaking to some of you there. So do feel free to ask your questions, which my wife Fiona will be directing to me.
It was a morning much like any other for George Herbert. Enchanted by speed and undeterred by risk, the young 5th Earl of Carnarvon put his Panhard Levasseur motor car through its paces, perhaps a bit fast, just as he had 1,000 times before. But in the blink of an eye, life as he knew it was over. The crash was the ultimate stroke of bad luck. and a bleak future lay ahead, or so it seemed. The once dashing, carefree 5th Earl of Carnarvon was left with severe injuries and lungs so badly damaged he was told to avoid English winters. Lord Carnarvon needed to heal, but he also required more than just warm weather to revitalize his spirit.
Great-grandfather was one of those sort of last great adventurers of the late Victorian and Edwardian period. So he takes himself to Cairo, and many other people would have just enjoyed the social scene there and the nice weather in the winter, but oh no, he was not going to do that. He wanted to be down at Luxor starting a quest.
Egyptology soon grabbed Lord Carnarvon's attention, and he enthusiastically took the plunge, assembling his own team, then scouring the swirling desert sands for the pharaoh's tombs.
In his first year, all he found was a mummified cat in a cat coffin.
Hindered by a lack of formal training, Lord Carnarvon nonetheless began delivering results.
He discovered the tomb of Teteki, a noble mayor of Thebes from a royal family, the beautiful coffin we have in the Highclere exhibition from the noble Lady Ertu, and many other objects.
Grand discoveries, however, remained elusive, and the urge to abandon the chase was a demon he faced and defeated at the end of each sweltering day.
He was a man of great persistence, and of course it became an absorbing passion and goal in life.
Passion, however, is no substitute for expertise.
Everything stepped up a whole level when he teamed up with Howard Carter. Although they came from very different backgrounds and types of life, they made a formidable pair together in their quest for what was beautiful and ancient.
Despite their best efforts, the ultimate prize, a pharaoh's tomb, remained just beyond reach. World War I pulled both men away. Excavations resumed in 1917, but after 4 more years of dashed hopes and unending frustration, Lord Carnarvon met with Howard Carter to end the search.
In June 1922, my great-grandfather was beginning to think, was this game really worth it to go on? Because after the war, taxes were much higher back home and things were becoming more difficult. But he was meeting up with Howard Carter, and the two men, whilst poring over a map of the Valley of the Kings, because at this stage they still had the concession there, decided they were going to have one more go. I think Howard Carter might have been rather a throwaway line, said to my great-grandfather, if you don't want to finance one more year, I'll finance it myself.
Carter, reinvigorated, returned to begin one last season, with Lord Carnarvon footing the bill and set to join later. Carter relentlessly pushed forward while fighting back a growing sense of desperation. Then, at last, a break. November 4th, 1922.
There was suddenly a cry from one of the workmen because he'd found what appeared to be a series of steps cut down into the ground. And Howard Carter comes over, and they all begin to get excited, and they keep on cutting this down, and they found a series of steps down to a door, and on the door there is the cartouche of Tutankhamun. But Howard Carter was a very honourable man, and he sent a telegram to his patron saying, "A possibly made wonderful discovery, come quickly." And he waited till Fifth Earl was there, and then of course they famously broke down that door, and they had the candles in their hands. And my great aunt, Evelyn, Lady Evelyn, she was with her father, my great grandfather, and Carnarvon says to Carter, "What do you see?" You can imagine it's as dark as I'm looking into the corner here now. There's just the candle and flickering around them, and all Carter can say in total amazement is "wonderful things."
Hidden since 1322 BC, Tutankhamun's tomb is said to be the best preserved and most intact pharaonic tomb ever found in the Valley of the Kings. Overflowing with treasures, it took a decade to catalogue. Sadly, Lord Carnarvon had very little chance to revel in the discovery. A simple mosquito bite led to pneumonia, and mere months later he was gone.
He never got to see the innermost shrine, the middle and the nested coffins, or indeed the extraordinary iconic golden mask. He died in the hour of his triumph in early April 1923.
The world overwhelmingly embraced the discovery, and people around the globe still queue up to view the astounding collection of more than 5,000 artifacts.
In his mind, he had this extraordinary idea that there was something there if you stuck at it long enough.
Lord Carnarvon's unwavering commitment in the face of impossible odds made him famous overnight. Yet back home in the halls of Highclere Castle, tales recounting the achievements and fame of the 5th Earl of Carnarvon were conspicuously absent, at least for one set of young ears.
My grandfather, who I loved and got to know very well, he was a great raconteur. He loved telling stories, but there was one flaw. He thought his father's sudden and premature death at a relatively young age brought him bad luck. And the Tutankhamun story was not something he shared with his grandchildren. The few Egyptian objects that Howard Carter had left at Highclere, my grandfather hid away in cupboards between two rooms and blocked the access off. We only discovered these objects after my grandfather died in the autumn of 1987. It was a strange moment that might have been a scene from Downton Abbey itself. And my father is walking around with Robert Taylor, my grandfather's butler, who was a very Carson-like chap and very the gentleman's gentleman. And Robert Taylor says to my father, "Oh, my lord, there is the Egyptian stuff, you know." And my father said, "What Egyptian stuff? There's none at Highclere. That's either in Cairo or in New York." Oh, he says, "There is. It's hidden between these two rooms."
Inspired by these priceless artifacts, the family created an immersive taste of Egypt inside the walls of Highclere.
My wife Fiona and I, we wanted to pay a tribute to the two men at Highclere, to show people about those discoveries and give them a better interpretation before they venture out to Egypt.
In all, there are 6 rooms of artifacts and exquisite replicas.
You're somehow touching the depths of humanity's time in the past. My great-grandfather, Lord Carnarvon, and Howard Carter, they did something for humanity, really. They left a lasting treasure for us all to enjoy, and it is rather amazing to be part of it.
Nearly a century later, very few tales of exploration capture the imagination quite like the story of Howard Carter and the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. In their relentless quest for Tutankhamun and the hidden tomb of Egypt's boy king.
Well, we're in our Egyptian exhibition in the cellars at Highclere Castle, and I'm just looking at one of the extraordinary objects that we have here
still from the time of my great-grandfather's work and excavations in Egypt in the first decade of the previous century. And it was around about 1907, 1908 when my great-grandfather returned to Egypt. It could be a second or third season of excavation. And he was basically looking at excavating the city of Thebes, the modern city of Luxor, on the West Bank. And he was given an area, really I suppose it would have been called the tombs, the area of the tombs of the nobles. And he came across this extraordinary tomb of an ancient mayor, really, an ancient mayor of Thebes, and also from the key 18th dynasty, which is the dynasty of Tutankhamun himself. And what we have here is a strange-looking object, but it's a tablet, really, an offering tablet with grooves that run through it. That would have been a priestly offering for oil or water. And this nobleman was called Tetaki. He could have easily been a king's, a pharaoh's son of the time. You see from my great-grandfather's photograph of the inner walls, it was quite a decorated tomb or chapel, which great-grandfather actually found himself. And he was always taking a photograph of a person outside to give an idea of a scale. Quite a sophisticated small tomb. It just shows the sort of care and detail of the work that great-grandfather, and of course indeed Howard Carter, his colleague, would have made there. And you see some little shabtis, little figurines, which people had alongside them when they were as mummies in their coffins. They were their workers to help them in the next world, as it were, when they were, as it were, resurrected. But this is one of the just extraordinary objects that we have here at Highclere. Amazing, really. Well, here we're looking at some of the rather extraordinary objects that we actually found here in the castle after the death of my grandfather. And these are objects that were found by my great-grandfather, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, and were left here at Highclere when most of his amazing collection before Tutankhamun was sold to the Metropolitan Museum in the mid-1920s by my great-grandmother. But they're rather fascinating, these, because there are literally, in this cupboard, we found these perfect little wooden trinket boxes, maybe up to 4,000 years old, and they were the faience blue colours, quite decorative. And they were found near the famous Lady Pharaoh, Queen Hatshepsut's mortuary temple by my great-grandfather. And they're just in incredibly good condition. You can still sort of practically open and slide the lids, and there's beautiful jewellery. You can understand it. There's an amazing little leather archer's wrist guard. So, you know, you're putting back a great bow, you need a wrist guard for your left wrist, and on it are stamped, and you can still see the traditional enemies of the pharaohs of Egypt. So the Syrians to the north and the Nubians to the south, they were the enemies of the great pharaohs of Egypt of the time. You know, just incredible little objects, really. Moving across a little bit to the right, there was one season my great-grandfather and Howard Carter, they went up to the north of Egypt, to the delta, much wetter area, and they didn't find too much, but they found one rather incredible collection of late Egyptian silver, Ptolemaic period silver. And this is some silver bracelets that they found at Tel al-Balamun, and they're there. Just really incredible things to look at today, really. It's not always known that one of the 5th Earl's great talents, in fact, was as an early and very accomplished photographer. He really understood the process, how to use the early cameras, and understood the chemistry and the plates and how to develop things. And we have one of his cameras he used a lot here in our exhibition, which is really rather amazing, plus some examples of his photography, not of Egypt, but as a portraitist photographer, and he even won prizes in this area. And then as far as Egypt is concerned, we have many small, very high resolution photographs which he took out in Egypt when he was both as a tourist and doing excavations. And this is a really rather wonderful shot of the Lady Pharaoh Hatshepsut's mortuary temple. And of course the Valley of the Kings is over the top, the other side of this small mountain. And the mortuary temple has been restored over many years by a great expert group from Polish archaeologists from Warsaw. But it's just an incredible sight cut into the base of this cliff. It's really worth seeing. And this resolution of this photograph, we managed to blow it up to this size from a small one, just shows the skill of great-grandfather's work in the world of photography.
Well, we remain in the archive part of our Egyptian exhibition here at Highclere. We're looking at my great-grandfather's actual medicine chest and first aid box of the time. And we can still see these little glass vials of tinctures of this and salts of that, and the one says tannic acid jelly and other excitements, medical excitements of the time. I'm sure all very useful to him and Howard Carter when they were out there in the heat of the desert, but everything that nature throws at you in those extreme conditions. But there's also a little bit more of his work as a photographer here. Of course, there's the one of his photographs is rather extraordinary. It's a sort of first effort at the colour photography with the colour tints appearing on the decorated saddle of the camel. There you see with the sunset and the pyramids in the distance. Not so easy to see from where I am, but you can actually see the flooded areas of the Nile down by the pyramids, which of course is a scene you'd never see now since the building of the Aswan Dam. And then at the bottom here, there's a rather wonderful photograph of the house which still stands today, that great-grandfather built for Howard Carter, his colleague in Egypt, and it's called Castle Carter, and it was built very cleverly to withstand the extreme heat and climate and be cool inside. And great-grandfather had a photography development room there. Carter lived there and did a lot of work, and they both stayed there quite a bit, not far from the entrance to the Valley of the Kings. Again, all these things are absolutely fascinating, really.
Right, so Geordie, I've got so many questions here in front of me, but let me start with Laverne from West Bloomfield. Geordie, can you tell us about some of your personal favourite items in Highclere's Egypt collection?
Gosh, difficult. There's so many wonderful things there. I think perhaps starting with one of the simplest is a very simple polished dish or very shallow bowl. It's one of our oldest objects from pre-dynastic times, or possibly 5,000 years old. And it's made from a type of slate called schist between the River Nile and the Red Sea. That's one of the simplest ones. And then there's one of the extraordinary objects we found hidden away in a cupboard here after my grandfather died. It was a beautiful little jewellery box. It came from the area around the famous Lady Pharaoh, Queen Hatshepsut's mortuary temple. And in it were, things like little tweezers that still work, and eye makeup sticks and that kind of thing. And then perhaps finally another quite small object, but it is rather extraordinary, a beautifully preserved archer's wrist guard. I think we saw both these objects in the video, which shows stamped on it the traditional enemies of Egypt, the Assyrians to the north, the Nubians to the south, and perhaps just one object from the real replica exhibition of replica items of Tutankhamun's tomb. One of my favourites is a beautiful painted chest, which shows Tutankhamun really as a family man, as a soldier and a hunter. And it's just so beautifully painted with all the rich colours they have there.
Thank you, Geordie. And there's a question from Clementine from Santa Barbara, and there's actually quite a few questions about the curse of Tutankhamun. So she asks, what is your take on the curse of Tutankhamun? And do you think any of your family believe there was really such a curse?
Well, I think that the ancient pharaohs were definitely worried about whether their tombs would be robbed after their death. Of course, that's happened in most cases. And they did put these curses on those that would break into the sacred seal of the tomb. And of course, it is always possible that someone coming into a tomb, like my great-grandfather Howard Carter, 3,000 years after it was originally sealed, might have come into some unfriendly spores in the air and that kind of thing. But I think probably in the sad case of my great-grandfather's death, his curse was really his love of early motor cars and slightly fast driving and too many crashes, which damaged his lungs and his health quite a lot. And then, of course, he was bitten by a mosquito he didn't look after. Sometime after the Great Find, he got septicemia. Nearly recovered from that in Cairo, nursed by his wife Almina and my great aunt Lady Evelyn, but then sadly succumbed to pneumonia and died in April 1923. The only thing about the curse was that Howard Carter was so involved in this whole project from the beginning and spent 10 years after my great-grandfather's death removing objects. He survived all the way until just before the start of of World War II and died in, I think it was August or September 1939. So there were people who died out in Egypt from strange reasons, and there were some weird paranormal things that happened when my grandfather died, like his dog dying here and the power of the electricity going out in Cairo. Probably overall, in his case, I think he already had weakened his body before the find.
Geordie, I'm going to ask you two questions which are sort of related. The first one from Vern in Seattle is, what was Lord Carnarvon's personal relation with Howard Carter? Did they get along? And an associated one is from Tony in Springfield, United States. Did Howard Carter ever visit your great-grandfather at Highclere Castle?
Well, they were both absolutely fascinating men from very different backgrounds, obviously, and they did, in fact, they're very different characters, but they actually got on very well. I mean, Howard Carter had become, he started as a very humble artist with the famous archaeologist Flinders Petrie in the 1880s. And of course, Flinders Petrie was involved with Tutankhamun's father's area. Tutankhamun, the father, the famous heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, and Howard Carter looking at his tomb area up at Amarna. And in a rather poignant way, Howard Carter went full circle when he found Tutankhamun's tomb with my great-grandfather, because the objects inside the tomb were so full of Amarna art. But anyway, the two men met up after Howard Carter had actually lost his job as an inspector of antiquities because he fell out with some French tourists who hadn't behaved too well at one of the tombs at Saqqara. There was a bit of a row. Anyway, he then didn't have a job, but my great-grandfather wanted a more expert collaborator. So around 1907, 1908, he met up with Howard Carter, and the two had this incredibly long-term partnership right up to the incredible find of Tutankhamun's tomb, and they got on very well. My great-grandfather, the traditional landed person with a title who'd come from a very different background. Howard Carter, the original amateur excavator who became a complete and absolutely exacting professional, wonderful draftsman. He became a sort of engineer of tombs. He could lay on electricity and construction around them, organize men, working at incredible heat and around Luxor and Thebes. And the two men with their own probably rather eccentric characters, really, because Howard Carter was a bit of a loner, and my grandfather was an eccentric adventurer. They got on rather well. And Howard Carter, of course, did visit Highclere quite a few times. One of the most important ones was the famous weekend in June 1922, when they finally decided they were going to excavate for one more season rather than give up what was becoming a slightly frustrating job.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Anika from Chester says, I find everything related to ancient Egypt fascinating. Can you recommend any particularly good books about Lord Carnarvon and Howard Carter's discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb? And just think about what I've written, Geordie.
Interestingly, there are books about Howard Carter. There's one or two of those, and they're great and scholarly. There's never been a book written about my great grandfather.
Yet.
Yes, and Darling, she is absolutely thinking in the process of getting a book about great grandfather going.
For
2022. Topical in line of the 100th anniversary of the discovery of the tomb. We did do an illustrated 100 page book called Carnarvon, didn't we?
And Egypt to Highclere.
Yeah, some 10 years ago, and we also photographed and described in some detail both our real objects and our replica objects in a small coloured book we have here at Highclere called Egypt to Highclere, which we sell in the gift shop and has been very popular.
Excellent, Geordie. Well done, you. Bill from the United States, on a slightly different subject, says, would you consider doing a walk-on cameo for Downton Abbey, perhaps similar to those given by Alfred Hitchcock?
Now, wouldn't that be great? I think over the years, probably Fiona and I have been, behind the camera and making sure all the crews are doing the right thing in often quite sensitive, delicate areas. But it would be fun for me, perhaps, to be a walk-on part.
For us.
But all right, both of us, yes. We're all dressed up as a maid and gardener and all the rest of it.
Thank you. I'm the gardener, you're the maid.
But well, we never know. It might happen. We're all looking forward to eventually another movie being made, which would be fantastic.
Thank you. Geordie, another question here. Clarence from Olathe, United States. What clues led to the exact location of the tomb?
Well, this was quite complicated long story, there was a previous excavator who had a concession to the Valley of the Kings called Davis. And he'd been excavating in probably around 1900 to about 1912 or so. And one of his excavations had discovered a shallow pit, probably about sort of 50 yards away from where Tutankhamun's tomb actually was. And no one had taken too much really detail or attention to the objects found inside. But one of them was a little cartouche, partly in gold, of the pharaoh Tutankhamun. It found its way back to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, because Mr. Davis was an American chap. And was it Ligo? What was his first name? The archaeologist Ligo was very involved in the Metropolitan Museum. He noted this and passed on the details to Howard Carter.
Herbert Winlock.
Winlock was one, and Ligo was another one, I think. And they anyway, it got back to Howard Carter that this was in fact significant, because what it was the sealing, a little priestly ceremony after Tutankhamun's tomb was sealed. So it was definitely a pointer to the fact that the tomb was somewhere in the vicinity. And when great-grandfather and Howard Carter, they had the concession for the Valley of the Kings, they started working again in 1918, 1919. Finally, they decided to do an area of the valley which was around the workman's hut of the great pharaoh Ramesses, which hadn't been excavated before. Partly, you'd be amazed to hear, because so many tourists walked over it, even in those days. But anyway, there was definitely a pointer to a as yet unfound pharaoh, in the case of the boy King Tutankhamun, and it was not so far away from the eventual opening of the tomb.
Wonderful. Can you answer James from Barnstable, the United States, who asks, what were the circumstances that led to Lord Carnarvon's death not long after the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb?
Well, great-grandfather had been rather, as was Howard Carter, rather overwhelmed by the global attention to the discovery of this extraordinary tomb. It must be following the miseries of the First World War. It was the world's great first media event. There was 8mm film, sound, that it was broadcast all around the world, photography, and everyone was descending on Luxor to try and get a piece of the action. Great-grandfather, to try and make life easy for himself, had sold the rights, or most of the rights to stories and photographs to the Times newspaper of London, not of course popular with everyone else, and causing more and more arguments. He had a bit of an argument with Howard Carter as to what was going to happen about access to the tomb. They all slightly thought they would take a breather. And great-grandfather goes off on a nice boat trip on the Nile in a little boat with his daughter, Lady Evelyn, and unfortunately gets bitten by a mosquito up on the cheekbone of his face, which probably he thought nothing much of and didn't treat with iodine or a useful disinfectant. Sadly, it became infected, and he began to get septicemia or blood poisoning. And he heads back to Cairo. My great-grandmother, in an early de Havilland plane, that's of course is significant because Geoffrey de Havilland first flew from one of our fields at Highclere. She flies all the way out to Alexandria and then meets up with her husband, now very sick, in Cairo. And my great aunt Evelyn was there as well. And then sadly, some weeks later, he died finally of pneumonia, and it was a very sad story. He died in the hour of his triumph, and there's some wonderful old black and white film we have of him taking objects out of the tomb, including the famous mannequin, in February 1922, and by mid-April he's not with us anymore. So it was a sad thing, but Howard Carter did very carefully spend the next 10 years taking all the objects out of the tomb and getting them down via the river to the Cairo Museum.
It was an extraordinary effort. In contrast, there's a very different question from Belinda from Roanoke of the United States, stepping away from death, which is, I have tried your Highclere Castle gin and absolutely love it. Linda, you are gorgeous. With a sprig of rosemary. A sprig of lavender is also good. What is your favourite way of drinking Highclere Castle gin?
Well, actually, amazingly for a gin, I quite like it. What we call the Noble, which is on the rocks. This is the lovely blue bottle we have here.
And it's on the Viking cruises.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely on. If you're a Viking cruise guests, you will definitely be able to have the gin later in the year. No, we have it in multiple ways, straight gin and tonics. Our wonderful butler, Louis Coelho, is a great mixologist. And we've had French 75, Aviators, the famous James Bond, was the Vesper Martini. That's a great one. Negronis, Fiona likes a nice Negroni. All sorts of things we do here with our own fruits, and citrus, which we grow in the orangery. I think there are multiple ways to enjoy the gin, and the great secret was the idea of in the production process, the gilling process, to have some of our Highclere Castle oats, which we grow on the farm here, that really makes it smooth and mellow. I hope you all enjoy a sip soon.
And we've also found some notes from Lord Carnarvon, the 5th Earl's butler, about how to make gin. Gin was done.
Oh yes, well actually it was always fun to look in the archive, and Fiona was looking around, and we found some great cocktails all written up by the butler at the time of my great-grandfather. So Highclere was always host to some great parties, and there must have been some wonderful gin cocktails here in the past. But anyway, we're certainly doing as well today.
There are a few more. There are a few questions, and they're all around the idea of whether discovering the tomb of Tutankhamun was a violation of a grave, and where Tutankhamun actually ended up, and your great-grandfather's view on this, Geordie. So do you want to just elucidate that particular question?
Well, of course, it was the only fully intact tomb of a pharaoh ever to be discovered, and many of these graves had been violated really in antiquity. Interestingly, Tutankhamun's tomb was in fact broken into not long after it was sealed, but they only managed just to take some bits from the first part of it, things like oils and unguents, which robbers thought was valuable to them. It was then resealed, and nature took a hand in preserving it, because there was a rock fall over the area which helped preserve it from tomb robbers. I think probably by the time it came to Howard Carter and my great-grandfather's quite careful work, it's quite reasonable for them to found the tomb and preserve that bit of extraordinary history of mankind, humanity, for us today. I mean, the Egyptian civilization lasted for 4,000 years. Ours is on around the 2,000 and a bit mark so far, and I hope we last another 2,000 years. It may be tough for us at the moment, but I think how the ancient Egyptians lived, what they understood of the world, how they managed themselves, their beauty in their art and their incredible ability to construct sophisticated buildings, it's worth us understanding and learning from. And I think that the fact that Howard Carter and great-grandfather found this amazing tomb has been a benefit to all mankind, really.
The questions are flooding in, Geordie, but there's a question, we're probably down to our last two questions, and one is from Sandra at Durwood saying, did Lord Carnarvon and Howard Carter have any formal qualifications in history or archaeology, and were the excavations at the time linked to a university or museum, or did they carry them out privately?
That's a very good question, because today, if you were doing anything like that kind of work they were doing, it would have to have been linked to a prominent, well-known museum, and with people who are already quite versed as recognised as scholars. In the days of great-grandfather and Howard Carter, it was more of an adventurer's time. Egypt actually was a protectorate of the UK rather than formally being part of the British Empire. And interestingly, because France had been earlier involved with Egypt, Britain rather shared some administration with France. So the French experts, and they were experts, actually people like Gaston Maspero, who originally gave my great-grandfather his first concession. They were very, very knowledgeable. I would suggest that Howard Carter, starting as a draftsperson within this peachtree, by the time he was involved with Tomb of Tutankhamun, had become a proper experienced scholar in how to look after objects. Great-grandfather had an extraordinary, although he was never trained in archaeology, he had an extraordinary eye for the glories of the past, and had already become a very proficient and skilled photographer. This, of course, was an absolutely key skill in recording exactly what you were doing in archaeology in Egypt at the time. So between the two men, with their care, attention, and specific skills in different areas, I would suggest they were worthy of the first really proper and careful excavation of a very important tomb. We would have to admit that some of the efforts in previous years were more of a treasure hunter type of thing, and things were discarded if they didn't appear to be of interest. But I would suggest that Howard Carter and Carnarvon were the first to adopt quite a detailed process of recording of every object, and everything had to be photographed and properly measured and just described before it went down to the museum in town.
And finally, perhaps for the last question, as we come to the end of this wonderful evening with Viking TV, it's a question from Edward in New Jersey, who sent it in a little bit earlier. Do you think there are any more great archaeological sites in Egypt yet to be discovered? So it's rather a huge question to answer in a minute or two.
Well, I think they had some interesting discoveries I think around the Saqqara region recently. So I think there's always more to be discovered. We haven't been in Egypt for quite some years, but the last time we were there, we were being shown some fairly recent and rather interesting discoveries at different places on the Nile. I also know there's been amazing work done with satellite imagery from space, which shows that the boundaries of some sites are rather larger than what's already been considered. So I expect there will be definitely more to find. It may not be in an obvious place in the Valley of the Kings, but certainly in other places. And we say goodbye from Highclere now. I wish you all a great time, great night. Stay safe and well, and look forward to hopefully seeing you all in a few weeks' time when we can all get together. Bye from Highclere for now.